Welcome. This is the Public Affairs Forum, sponsored by the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, Texas. We invite you to join us on Sundays. These forums are free and open to the public, and we hope that you will join us. My name is Luther Elmore. Today, to introduce our speaker, one of our forum members, Mr. Eric Hartman. Eric?
Thank you, Luther. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, someone who, judging by the turnout, does not need an introduction. I'll give it anyway. She's going to be talking, this is State Representative Donna Howard, who's going to be talking to us about what happened in the recently concluded legislative session. We had originally conceived this as entirely a recap of a legislative session. It may turn out also to be a preview of what is to come. We will find that out soon, I suspect. In any case, we couldn't ask for a better guide to what's going on at the state capitol. Since Donna won her House seat in a special election in 2006, she has become one of the leaders in the Texas legislature in many areas, including the budget, healthcare, education. She has excelled in all aspects of legislative work. If you watch what goes on at the Capitol, you can see who the show horses are and who the workhorses are. And Donna is definitely one of the people who gets the work done and is highly respected on both sides of the aisle for that. It helps, in my view, that she's a member of what I call the grown-up caucus at the Capitol. And by that, I don't just mean that she had already conducted herself in a life full of civic engagement before she ever got to the Capitol, whether in health education or as a leader of the Eanes School Board or in many other civic involvements, but also that she is one of those rather unusual legislators who actually believes that reasoned argument ought to prevail. So with that belief, armed with that belief, however, she also, if you've seen her in action on the House floor, you will know that she brings not just reason, but passion, a passion for making this state a better place. And it keeps her going, it keeps all of us going to watch you do it, Donna. And we are very grateful to have you as our guide to the legislature today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, friends, for being here. It's good to be back with the rest of the world. I feel like I've been cloistered for months now. In fact, I have been. And, you know, trying to think about what I was going to say today, for one thing, I had to write some things down because I'm somewhat sleep deprived, and I was afraid of just the free-form flow of words and what might come out, although that still may be an issue. But here we're at the beginning of the end. And I'm still processing. Those of us that were even there every single day doing these things still don't know about some of the legislation that passed, where things are. Some of you in this room participate in advocacy at the legislature and probably know more than I do about certain areas that you've been working on. It'll take us a while, but we'll get through it. I just wanted to go over those, some kind of a rough outline from my perspective at this point in time, you know, not even a week after session ended, about what I think happened, where I think we are, and maybe some about where we might be going. As you know, we have a part-time legislature that only meets for 140 days every other year. And we're waiting to hear whether or not the governor is going to call us into a special session, which I think nobody really knows what's going to happen there. It's going to depend on what the governor and his political advisors determine is the best politically advantageous thing for him to do. And there's a lot of things going on with our leadership, in particular between the lieutenant governor and the governor at this point, so we'll see where that goes. But my office and I named the previous session, the 84th session, Missed Opportunities and Misplaced Priorities. We had a surplus to work with the previous session, and I felt like we made some headway, but we really missed a lot of opportunities to catch up with some things that had suffered greatly from previous major cuts to the budget in particular. This session, we're labeling it could have been worse. And You know, it's funny, but it's also not when you think about it too. You know, the fact that that's the best we can say is it could have been worse, but that is the best that some of us can say about the session that just ended. In fact, I think that many of us would consider it to be basically the worst session we've experienced, many of us. And my desk mate, Celia Israel, I think her hashtag is miserable session. And I have seen others that are worse session, but ours is going to be could have been worse. Just a quick little overview here. We filed 6,631 bills and 1,208, the last I checked with our legislative reference library, 1,208 have gone to the governor. This is very similar to previous sessions. We typically pass a few more bills than that, but we actually had something, Karen mentioned it to me when I first got here, the Mother's Day Massacre, if some of you heard about that, where the local and consent calendar for local, usually non-controversial bills, 100 of them were killed by the Freedom Caucus, which is it's not exactly the Tea Party, although you could call it that. They label themselves the Freedom Caucus, and they were very upset about the fact that they had legislation that was not moving, and so they used parliamentary procedure to basically kill 100 bills on the calendar that day. Obviously very disappointing to many people who had local bills on that calendar. Some were able to make it up later, but many were not. As of May 31st, the governor had signed 286 of those over 1,200 bills and has not vetoed anything as of yet. That was May 31st. We'll see what happens this next week. There were 169 joint resolutions filed, which means that you're going to have some constitutional amendments to vote on come November. November 7th, I believe, is when the ballot's going to be. You know, just FYI, we currently have 491 amendments to our Constitution. Really amazing, isn't it? I mean, we ask you to vote on all kinds of things, like I think it was last time or the time before, we asked you to vote on a constitutional amendment that preserved the right to hunt. Yeah. Lest you think you might have been challenged there with your ability to do so, we made sure in the Constitution that you now know you can. But really, oftentimes things are put in the Constitution, I think, because of a lack of trust in the legislative body to ensure that certain things are in the Constitution and therefore you can count on them happening more regularly than we would come back the next session and maybe change it. That being said, you're going to have, at this count, probably 6 or 7 constitutional amendments that I can glean from the Legislative Reference Library. So I'm going to tell you what a couple of them are here so that you can anticipate what you might be able to vote on in November. One is homestead property tax exemption for spouses of first responders who are killed in the line of duty. One is requiring the court to provide notice to the Attorney General if a state statute is being constitutionally challenged, so that we can get a heads up if somebody thinks that something we've done is unconstitutional, and then we can put in place some kind of a waiting period before the courts can render judgment, which is kind of an interesting one. Homestead property tax exemption for disabled veterans and spouses if they were provided a charitable home at a lesser than market value. Another one is for gubernatorial appointments that have expired, which happens very frequently. The appointments that the governor makes, they expire, but the person continues until the successor is appointed. Well, this constitutional amendment would say that that won't happen. You won't continue to serve until the successor is appointed. Your term will end at the last day of the legislative session during which your term expired. And I don't know what's supposed to happen then, but that's the constitutional amendment. Amended home equity loans by reducing caps on fees, allowing refinancing into non-home equity loans, allowing home equity loans on agricultural homesteads, etc. And expanding the definition of charitable foundation sports teams that can conduct charitable raffles. Yeah. And then this is one that the governor really wanted, calling for a convention of states, limiting the terms for U.S. office holders and canceling previous calls to a call for a convention of states. That one is a baffling one to me, why that was such a high priority for the governor and for others, but it did indeed pass, and you will be voting on that. The biggest thing, I guess you could say, about the dynamics of this last legislative session, which most of you are aware of, is there was a lot of a standoff between the House and the Senate. More division between those two bodies probably than many of us have seen before anyway. And then certainly there were a lot of differences between the big three, the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the Speaker of the House. So with all three of them having differences, with the Senate and the House having major differences, there was probably less movement on some things. Maybe that's good than there would have been otherwise. I mean, everybody here, we say it over and over again every time we're together, the old adage about, why people don't want us to hang around more than we do, that we meet for 140 days every 2 years. Some people say we should meet for 2 days every 140 years, but that never gets old. So let me go over some of the legislation that I think was key. There's some things I'm going to leave out and that may be very important to you. I'm just going to kind of go over a few things, but I wanted to start by talking about the big three and their priorities for this session. Governor Abbott had emergency legislation. He wanted to address CPS reform for our foster care system, sanctuary cities, he wanted those banned. Ethics, he apparently wanted us to do a better job of ethics. The Convention of States we just talked about, and at the very end of the session, he added an emergency item for voter ID. House Speaker Strauss's legislative agenda included CPS reform as well, school finance reform, kind of a high priority for many of us, more investments in mental health, restoration of the Medicaid therapy rate reductions, which we can talk about as well, and small business development and encouraging entrepreneurship. That's kind of a different agenda. And then Lieutenant Governor Patrick's agenda, and he came up with several iterations. I'm just going to refer to some in his initial 10. I think he came up with 3 different times he had lists, but this is the initial group. Property tax reform and tax caps, school choice, or AKA vouchers, sanctuary cities ban, voter ID, bathroom privacy, inappropriate student-teacher relationships, fetal tissue and partial birth abortion ban. Partial birth, I will say, is not a medical term. That's just what he used. And hailstorm insurance reform. So that's where our 3 leaders were coming from. I will say that there was a lot of bipartisan work and effort that went into putting significantly more dollars into the Child Protective Services program, the DFPS, with hundreds of millions of dollars in the ability to hire more caseworkers, a significant salary increase to try to address retention and turnover, which obviously has a significant impact on working with these children, and then several pieces of legislation that actually addressed how the program works in terms of what would happen with the kinship, paying more to families that took care of some of these kids, moving some into community-based programming. There was some concern about privatization. We'll see where that goes, but lots of things going on there. Not all that I was happy about. There were those that wanted a variety of things done, but the bottom line is it was moving forward. It's, I don't think, a perfect system by any means, but it's much better than it was. We'll see what happens with kind of the experiments that are going on. A little concerned about that, but quite frankly, we've had many children die under the state's watch. We've had many children that have had to stay in state offices because we don't have placements for them. So the things that are being done to try to address those very crisis type situations hopefully will come to fruition fairly soon here. Sanctuary cities ban. What that got turned into was what some of my colleagues label show me your papers legislation. What the Senate wanted was exactly that, the more stringent form of what could happen if you are arrested and required to show documentation papers. What the House proposed was a so-called milder version where you had to actually be arrested. You couldn't just be detained to have your citizenship papers checked. But what ended up happening in a very, very long and divisive and emotional day of dealing with this legislation is an amendment did get tacked on that now says that even if you're detained, you can have to show your papers. And that means that, you get stopped for faulty tail light, or you happen to be in the car with other people who get stopped for the faulty tail light. This is despite testimony from all the law enforcement community across the state in terms of our major metropolitan areas were all opposed to this legislation. They were all opposed to it because they said it would make their jobs harder. It would push people into the shadows. They would not report crime. They would be afraid to come forward. Art Acevedo, who used to be obviously here in Austin, is now in Houston, was one of the biggest opponents of this legislation, testifying several times about it. Now feels like he's being put in the position of not being able to actually manage potential hotheads on his force who might want to show their ICE-type credentials. And because of this legislation, he can't really stop that. There's all kinds of ramifications of this, not the least of which, though, is what it's doing to many families in our community. If any of you saw any of the testimony, it was very sad to see some of these children who were crying and concerned about what was going to happen to their parents. It's instilling a lot of fear in our communities. And the city of Austin, as well as San Antonio and El Paso and others, are suing over this legislation. So we'll see what happens there. That's a bad one. Mentioned Convention of States already. Voter ID. What was happening there is the Republicans wanted to improve the bill to meet more of what the court was looking at, so that they might be able to get something that would pass muster. They did indeed add some things that made it more palatable, but at the same time, it's still an onerous piece of legislation that has heightened criminal offenses for maybe mistakenly marking a ballot. It's very unclear how this is going to be enforced. Additionally, eliminated straight ticket voting, which, as a former board member of Common Cause Texas, as somebody who has been very involved for years with good government, I see, theoretically, the value of not having straight ticket voting in terms of wanting citizens to be engaged enough in the process to know who they're voting for. The reality, of course, is that we have extremely lengthy ballots, that people do not know who all is on the ballot. They rely on some kind of identifier. Oftentimes it's the political affiliation, the party affiliation, to cast their votes. And also due to the length of the ballots, because golly, y'all, we vote on just about everything. And that's good in lots of ways, but at some point, people aren't paying attention. At some point, they stop on the ballot, going down and voting for some of the down ballot races. So not sure really who this serves, other than the fact that it does serve those who have voters who are willing to go through an entire ballot, and those that represent maybe less educated, those who represent those who may speak different languages. In other words, the Democratic Party is concerned about what the impact is going to be on electing Democrats in areas of the state. And we'll just see what happens. It doesn't go into effect till 2020, so there's time to put this in place yet, but that is something that did happen. Abortion restrictions. We can't have a session without abortion restrictions, apparently. It's been going on now for several. And as if you'd think there's nothing more that can be done, there is, and there was. The biggest parts of the restrictions that came into place this time had to do with not selling fetal tissue, which is already against the law, with burial of fetal remains, and that means miscarriages as well as abortions, not if they occur at home, but if they occur in a clinic or a hospital, then they must be either cremated and disposed of as you would any cremated remains, or buried, interred. Right now, the common practice for any kind of medical waste, including any remains that might come from a miscarriage or an abortion, are disposed of with incineration and in a sanitary landfill. You can see the optics and the narrative around this. It's a very difficult thing to talk about. It has a lot of emotion attached to it, and it was portrayed as not being respectful of potential life. And those that were pushing this legislation, of course, referred to it as the fetal remains as an unborn child. And so that passed, which creates many difficulties for the providers. It creates trauma oftentimes for the women who are having either a miscarriage or an abortion to have to deal with this. We'll see how it's going to play out too, but that was a really difficult one. And then in addition to that, there was a banning of dilation and evacuation in the second trimester, which is the medical procedure of choice for that point of a pregnancy. It's the least invasive. It has the least complications. But we're now saying that that cannot be a choice that a physician makes in the physician's medical decision. They can't make that based on their medical training and knowledge. They've got to do what the legislature says, which is you can't do that procedure, which is the safest, most effective choice of physicians, and instead you have to use methods that are more difficult, more complicated, and certainly filled with more trauma for the woman. Ethics. We only addressed that partially, as we tend to do. You know, we like to talk about ethics, but when it comes to actually passing the legislation that holds us to certain ethical standards, we sometimes hold back on it, and this has been no exception this session. There was legislation passed that had to do with requiring elected officials to report contracts that they have with local governments. That was a good thing. But revolving door type legislation that we've had time and time again did not pass. There was a whole lot about local control, which has been so interesting, of course, when we for so long have heard from the majority party that local control is sacrosanct, that we should be looking at giving more and more local control. However, this session, it was all about taking that local control away and making sure that the state put itself in the position of deciding what's best for our local communities to do. The ride sharing situation that was voted on here in Austin, you know, I've heard some of my colleagues say that the state needs to step in and do the will of the people if the local communities won't do it. Well, the will of the people, they spoke loudly and clearly. And yet, here we saw that obviously that didn't sway the majority. And so we now have a statewide situation that doesn't allow Austin to impose the fingerprinting that it was wanting to do. We also had a very interesting coalition of folks working on linkage fees, which is one tool that can be used for creating affordable housing. It's not something that was a done deal. It's just one of the many tools that could be used for affordable housing. It's just to charge a per square footage fee for development that would apply toward affordable housing. It's been done in other communities. It's something that some in the building community wanted, that some of the housing advocates wanted, that some developers wanted. It was a very interesting coalition of folks across a wide spectrum. But because it was something that was considered a fee that would be tacked on locally, the state decided again that that wasn't going to be possible. And not only could it could not even be a tool in your toolbox, it can't happen at all. So that was defeated. But there were some things that were pushed back on successfully. Annexation, for one. You may or may not agree with the annexation part. I have constituents on both sides of that issue. But the fact is that preventing the city of Austin from being able to annex. The way the bill was structured is it would make null and void some agreements that already exist with some outlying areas that are in the process of being annexed, and push those costs back onto current city residents rather than honoring the agreements that had already been made. So that was defeated. Also defeated was the bag ban and tree ordinance situation, short-term rentals, and most important for our local communities, the rollback election for local property taxes. Once again, we banned texting while driving. That's happened many sessions in a row. You know, Governor Perry vetoed that the last time, and we'll see what Governor Abbott chooses to do this time. Pension problems with Dallas and Houston were severe enough that it was going to impact the state, and we had to step in, which we did. Compromises made, but that was addressed. The Sandra Bland Act. Garnett Coleman from Houston, Representative Coleman, carried this legislation. It was a watered-down version that finally passed, but there's still at least a Sandra Bland Act that is beginning to address protecting people with mental illness who are arrested and may end up harming themselves while in jail. There was also one called David's Law, which is legislation to crack down on cyberbullying through a reporting mechanism and creating a criminal offense. This was a result of a 16-year-old boy in San Antonio who ended up killing himself after the bullying that he received. There was a lot of legislation about addressing campus sexual assault, which has become a big issue in recent years. It's an interesting thing to think about because it's not, I don't believe, the case that all of a sudden sexual assaults are occurring. It's just that all of a sudden now we're paying attention. And unfortunately, we're finding it's much more widespread than many of us would like to believe. So there was a lot of legislation to do some things to make it easier to report, because it's one of the least reported crimes that occurs, to give amnesty to students who may be, for instance, on a campus that doesn't allow drinking, or if they're underage, to be able to report and have amnesty for reporting, even if they have had some minor violation of some other aspect of the law. We also had legislation addressing the backlog of the rape kits, and we put some money in the budget for that. And then I had a piece of legislation that I was able to get through and get money in the budget for, which is to track the rape kits, which is just mind-boggling to me as I learned more about it. Those rape kits were getting lost. Part of the reason we weren't addressing the examination of those rape kits is because we couldn't find them. And when we say rape kits, it's important to understand that it's not just that little box. There is a box, a rape kit, that has specific things in it. But there's also, as you can well imagine, other items such as bedding or clothing that also are part of the forensic data that needs to be looked at. And oftentimes you don't find anything in the kit that is capable of identification. You need those other articles as well. This is a way to put them all together with, what is it, RFID, the tracking things like you'd use, you know, with tracking your Amazon package. It's the same kind of thing. And they're able to keep track of this in the process of the examination, storage in the hospital, getting to the police, getting to the lab, wherever this needs to go. And one of the things that makes this so important is that now that we have a more robust national data system, being able to track these and make sure we're actually getting that data and getting it entered into the system is going to further give us a robust system. But also what Houston found, and they've been one of the leaders in this, is that when they were doing their DNA testing, they actually had hits of about 30% with the national database. That tells you that there's a lot of repeat offenders as well as those who have committed other crimes. And this is especially interesting and helpful as we move forward with how to address this horrific situation we find ourselves in, because most of the sexual assaults are committed by people that know the victim. And so oftentimes the failure to report and the failure to pursue is because of, one, they know who the person is, and two, because it's somebody they're trying to protect. we hopefully, with the kind of legislation we pass this time, we'll see more of the evidence getting where it needs to go, and we'll be able to prevent further crime, hopefully, by doing this. We did not end up having any legislation passed that would discriminate against transgender people, thank goodness. There were a lot of efforts, of course, particularly to restrict where people can go to the bathroom. That is something, of course, that the Lieutenant Governor is holding over our heads as a reason that he thinks that we should come back into a special session. This was something that went on the entire session from day one. When I had an amendment that was accepted at the very beginning of session for our House rules that was just setting up a place where the reporters could go who were nursing so that they could nurse their babies. We could make sure we had breastfeeding accommodations. That was it. And they tacked on bathrooms to that. It didn't make it, but it was like every day you were looking for where are they going to try to tack it on today. But we did get through without that happening. We'll see where that goes. And again, for those of you that have been following that, it's a solution in search of a problem. It's not been an issue. The issue is actually where transgender people go to the bathroom is because they're having to figure out where they go, where they feel most comfortable, not because we have to worry about somebody who's transgender coming into the bathroom. But it is very discriminatory, and the business community, of course, was very strongly against it, although toward the end I think they probably did not maintain their vigilance against it as much as they could have. We'll see where we go. No redistricting happened. We had a redistricting committee that never met. And the big one for me is we did not pass HB 21, which was the House's effort to come up with some kind of school finance reform. A real missed opportunity there. So I just real quickly will tell you about a couple of the bills that I was involved with directly. I already mentioned the rape kit tracking. I also have been working for a couple of sessions now on violence in the workplace for nurses. Contrary to what some may believe, nurses actually experience more violence in the workplace than law enforcement. It's hard to imagine that. But when you think about it, nurses are oftentimes in a position where they're dealing with people who are debilitated in some way, perhaps dementia, perhaps have drug situations that are changing how they're acting. They're not acting normally. There may be high emotional situations with family members, all kinds of things that happen. And unfortunately, on average, 17 nurses die each year from workforce-related violence. So we've been looking at this for a couple of sessions and trying to determine what are some best practices to try to prevent this violence in the workplace. You can imagine what that does to turnover, too. So anyway, we got legislation passed this time that is going to set up some prevention grants for some best practices that will help some of our hospitals and healthcare settings to implement, hopefully, ways to better protect the nurses. Webcasting of health and human service meetings. I've gradually over the years had legislation to webcast any and everything that I think is important to webcast. We should just be webcasting everything, but we're not there yet. And we had several instances where we would hear from folks who attended health commission hearings, perhaps on women's health care, perhaps on the Medicaid rate reductions, could not attend because they lived too far away, but they weren't broadcast and they wanted to keep up with what was going on. So now we have legislation that puts that in place. This one's just kind of a fun one. We designated the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center as the state arboretum, botanical garden arboretum. And the reason that's so critical, really, in a lot of ways for us, is that it sets them up to a level of being able to do more in our state, and it's an amazing, amazing gift that we have. We're trying to get some more money involved with what happens at the state capitol complex to where we can actually use the Wildflower Center to help us use more indigenous plants rather than the St. Augustine that we have everywhere. Yeah. And we are making some headway there. And the Wildflower Center is intimately involved with the Preservation Board, State Preservation Board, and the Facilities Commission as we look at the master plan for expanding the Capitol complex so that we can incorporate some of these plants in the design there. I also had a constituent who was a state employee for 12 years, disabled veteran, who came to me with proposed legislation that we were able to get passed through amending it to something. And that is, as a disabled vet, he has many physical and behavioral issues that require attending, going to the VA clinics that are not always close by to where you work, and having difficulty finding enough time to get off from work to be able to get these needs cared for. And we have state employees, of course, all over this state, and we don't have VA hospitals in every single community. So this legislation just gives more flexibility to agencies to let them allow these employees to have more time off so that they can get their needs met. Other things, I won't go into all the rest of it stuff. There's a bunch more, but let me go into the budget. We passed a $217 billion two-year budget, which is only 0.2% more than 16-17, despite our growth, despite inflation. And when you look at inflation and population growth, the budget that we just passed is about a 7.5% reduction in the budget that we're currently in, which is already not funding everything. The state contribution to the budget is actually less than the 16-17 amount of state funds. So one of the ways that we balanced our budget is we continued the practice that we've been doing for years of using dedicated funds to help cover the costs of things in the budget. So for several sessions now, we've been trying to reduce that, and we've been able to slowly but surely do that, but we couldn't do it this time. So we actually are using, I don't know, about $4 billion that we're taking from you from a particular purpose, not spending it on that purpose, and just holding on to it so that we can balance the budget. Okay? In addition to that, we did actually get a compromise to use about $1 billion of the Economic Stabilization Fund, which is the rainy day fund, which is projected to have $12 billion in it. So it'll only have $11 billion in it. $11 billion. Might as well put it in the mattress. We're not doing anything with it. But we did use $1 billion of it. We also deferred a state highway fund payment to the tune of about $1.8 billion to help certify the budget. So point being, our budget is balanced. We're required to have a balanced budget, but it's not balanced because we've actually paid for everything. We're using methods of finance and deferrals and other things to balance our budget. And we will actually come back and owe more when we come back in January 2019 because we underfunded Medicaid as we usually do. There were some good things in the budget. I ended up voting for it. There were some good things in the budget. We put more money into the TRS, Teacher Retirement System health plan, so that it's actually solvent. It was not going to be. One of the things I got in there was $25 million for broadband connectivity. It was an E-rate matching fund with the feds that was going to go away. It's going to translate into about $225 million, and it will help us connect school districts throughout the state because we have many school districts that are not connected to broadband. And you cannot teach and learn in the 21st century without that kind of connectivity. Some of you may have seen an article that was last year or so in New York Times that showed the kids, I think it was in McAllen someplace, somewhere in the valley, where they were sitting on the sidewalk outside of the school because they don't have internet at home, and they had to do their homework sitting on the sidewalk outside. You know, there's inequality in our state, obviously. We maintained higher ed funding. It's still lower than it should be, but we were anticipating a much bigger hit, so that was actually a positive. We already talked about foster care. We got more money in to help address some of the maintenance issues at the State Supported Living Center and the state hospital. Increased funding for mental health care. We funded the Dell Medical Center. That was definitely not going to perhaps happen if the Senate had its way. There was no money in the formula funding for the Dell Medical Center, so that did get in there. There was a slight increase in tuition assistance, some of what I would consider the bad part. We use a huge amount of local property taxes to balance our budget. The state is funding its schools with $1.6 billion less than the current biennium. So in other words, the state, even with a growing student population, is putting in $1.6 billion less. And that's because your property taxes have gone up, and we're going to let you pay for it with your local property taxes and let the state off the hook. So right now, I don't know what the final number is going to be here, but the number I'm hearing is it's going to be below 36% of the cost of public education will be paid for by the state, and the rest is being paid for, minus the part that the feds are doing, by local property taxes. So when you keep hearing from the Senate in particular about how we've got to address property tax reform, and they want to put a rollback rate at 5% instead of 8%, and they want to require elections, which are costly, all these things, that's not what's going to make a difference. Over half of your property taxes are for schools. The only way to address the rising property taxes that you're paying is by having the state maintain its fair share of the cost of public education. And as long as we allow the current formula to be in place, we're going to see continuing decreases in the state's share of that funding and continuing over-reliance on local property taxpayers. That's where we are right now, and you know that's absolutely what's making the biggest difference in your tax bill. We met the needs of the governor at the last minute with quality pre-K. Quality pre-K is a good thing. We want to be going that direction. What we did last session was too little to make much of a difference, but it was still the governor's wish to have that continue. So what ended up happening was the governor got the high quality pre-K, but no new money. It was really a carve out from existing money. So schools are going to be required to implement the more costly factors that go in with quality pre-K, which is making it full day, having certified teachers, having lower teacher-student ratios, those kinds of things. They're going to have to do that without any new money. I don't know how this one's going to happen, but anyway, that's going on. The Medicaid therapy rate reductions that we worked so hard on over the interim, and that the Speaker of the House was adamant about our replacing. We only were able to restore 25% of the cuts. And this is about those children who need occupational speech and physical therapy that get this through Medicaid. The rate reductions were put in place despite flawed data that led to that. It was reported that 60,000 children with disabilities may end up without services. We've already had providers closed down. This is really serious. We're talking about disabled children. We're not talking about, as I said the other day, how to learn how to say R. We're talking about learning how to swallow. We're talking about kids that have cerebral palsy, that have all kinds of situations that require these vital services to be functional. And, you know, not that we should even have to say this, but it's not even about poor children, although it's a lot about poor children. It's also about the children of people that could be in this very room, your neighbors, middle class, upper middle class, and even rich Texans. Because there's a lot of programs that provide services through the Medicare and Medicaid program for children with disabilities, regardless of what your income is, that's how it's paid for. So this is really a serious thing impacting people throughout Texas. And unfortunately, we weren't able to get it restored to the level we wanted to. We kept border security at the level it was at, you know, thank goodness. Despite the House trying to lower it, the Senate wouldn't budge on that. And, you know, this is also despite the fact that we now have a new president who has claimed that he's going to do something about the border. But we went ahead and put that money in there, and that's a pretty big outrage to many of us. I just want to close with a comment that I read maybe today, recently anyway, from the Texas Observer, which kind of summed things up for me. It says, "The Republican Party of Texas, hostage to its own overreach and gerrymandered districts, will never fix itself. In the closing days of this year's session, a wide array of legislative veterans, conservative Republicans, business Republicans, Democrats, lobbyists, and journalists agreed that there was something uniquely acrid in the air, and that it had pervaded just about everything." And that kind of sums up the 85th legislative session. So I'm happy to take some questions before we close.
Thank you, Donna. We only have about 15 minutes left, and so we will have a short period of questions and answers.
Quick question. From my perspective, I see my property taxes shooting up every year and a huge expansion in the population base in places like Austin and other big cities. With all this money coming in, could you explain why the state is chronically short of money for its budget?
Well, actually, the question had to do with all the money coming in from all these property taxes. Why is the state chronically underfunded here? And in fact, the state is, as I've said before, benefiting from this by spending less. The states, if you look at over time, the Legislative Budget Board has charts that will show you over time in constant dollars how we're paying for public education. And the state's share actually trends downward, and the local is trending upward. So we are actually, the state is benefiting from those local taxes. Why we still don't have enough, I can't say, other than we keep making decisions to lower revenue streams. We're unwilling to look at additional revenue streams. We're unwilling to look at certain fees. There's many over at the Capitol right now that feel very much guided by limited government and the whole mantra of, drowning in the bathtub, the Grover Norquist thing, shrinking government so that you can drown in the bathtub, if you haven't heard that quote. And so, we continue to limit ourselves. It's self-imposed. It's self-imposed. And we continue to complain about what the local governments are doing. Yet we pass more and more mandates onto the local governments, less money with which to do what they're going to do, and more restrictions on how they can raise their revenue. It's baffling.
Front page of the Statesman today, a business lobby giving allowances said he was surprised at an anti-business atmosphere. And the rhetorical question, what kind of people are we putting in the legislature in the state of Texas?
Yeah.
Your comments, please.
Well, I think that, we have nationally as well as statewide a trend toward people who are rebelling against government and rebelling against status quo and rebelling against the establishment. And business is caught up in that as well. So we see, I think, we've got quite a few legislators who now are in place that what you traditionally would have thought would be pro-business, but in this case, because business is identified with the establishment of the Republican Party, and to some degree with some of the Democrats, it is perceived as not being the credible source for what guides the legislature. Right now, we are being guided by a small minority. And part of that, I think, has to do with our primary election system and our redistricting that has drawn non-competitive districts to where we make decisions in the primary when we have many fewer voters, and the extremes of the parties are what we hear from in the primaries. We have a couple of folks in Texas who are of that ilk, who have a lot of money, and they have created a very loud, even if I consider it a minority, a very loud voice that is constantly goading my Republican colleagues in particular, keeping scorecards, sending nasty things into their district. Even during the session, some of my colleagues were having robocalls in their district, trying to align them with something onerous, including, supporting the Speaker of the House. Like, that's a really bad thing. I don't know. I don't know what we're going to be able to do until we change redistricting, until we change the lines about how have more competitive districts that are more reflective of the communities of interest. Some have tried having open primaries. Maybe that's an answer for us too. I don't know. The fact is that we seem to, at least the Republican Party in particular, seems to be being held hostage to this scorecard that reflects the needs of a small minority, but they're vocal and they're very powerful. and they have a lot of money, and the business community is sometimes a part of that and sometimes not. So it's a really different landscape than it used to be.
With the number of abortion regulation bills that have been passed in the past several sessions and prohibiting the D&E in the second trimester, can't somebody sue the legislature for practicing medicine without a license?
Well, there certainly have been lawsuits, and as you know, there have been some victories at the Supreme Court for overreach on the part of the legislature. Restrictions on D&E are part of that as well. There's all kinds of challenges that are going on in the court system right now, and some of the legislation we passed, as I said, is already unconstitutional, but they still want to have it on the books. And there seems to be also this whole policy of keeping us tied up in courts. You can affect a lot of damage before you get an opinion that reverses something onerous that's been put in place. If you just look back to what happened with all the clinics that closed down with previous legislation that have now been able to reopen, but the damage was done in that interim period to many women and their families who didn't have options. And one of the things that was talked about a lot this session, but we didn't do as much as we should have, got put on the back burner to some extent, is the increase in postpartum maternal mortality that we found in our state, equating us with third world countries. It's a significant rise we've had in maternal mortality. Some hypothesize that part of that is due to the reductions that occurred in previous sessions that limited options for women. They didn't get the prenatal care they needed, they didn't get the postpartum care they needed, and they ended up dying. So, your message, though, is well taken.
It was mentioned about property taxes. That is one my big issue. I have a lot, but that's my big issue. Most states, the property taxes are better. Well, maybe because they have a state income tax. Well, forget that. But why is it that the little guy pays higher property taxes and yet the corporations come in here and they can't seem to tax the corporations? It's a simple solution. If you could do it, you will agree it's a simple solution, but why can't they tax the corporations more?
Well, it's probably not as simple as it sounds, but there are those that want to have more of an interim study looking at what are our revenue streams and what can we do that really reflects more equity, fairness across the system. It's very hard to take away something that's already in place and to implement something differently. For instance, our revised franchise tax, which was one of the first votes I had to take in 2006 to pay for schools back then. That was a blue ribbon committee appointed by Governor Perry, chaired by John Sharp. I think it was 24 different business and industries that were a part of it, decided, yes, we'll change the business franchise tax to make it more fair and equitable. We'll expand the base, lower the rate, bring more people in paying it. It will grow with the economy. It's one of the ways we can help pay for education. Before the ink was dry, basically, we started eroding that particular piece of legislation to where we have decreased the amount coming in session after session of that particular tax, and that goes directly to paying for our schools. We've got to find revenue somehow, somewhere, and it's very difficult to figure out ways to do that you can get enough buy-in, especially from 181 legislators who represent different parts of the state and different interests. So, I don't know what the answer is there. Clearly, when you don't have an income tax and and the corporations are paying, yes. We have a business tax that's not reflective of all the businesses in our state. We've become more of a service economy. Those services are not taxed. A lot of people don't want those services to be taxed. We have sales tax, which some want to replace the property tax with the sales tax, which would be astronomical to do something like that, and very regressive if we did that. We've already talked about the problems with our property tax system right now. There are no easy answers to this, and yet we've got to find a way to increase the size of the pie, because all we're doing now is keeping the pie the same or making it smaller, and trying to divvy up those slices in a way that meets the needs of the state. It just doesn't happen. There are a lot of losers with the smaller slices of pie. And I'm particularly thinking about public education, and one of the reasons that we can't seem to get off the dime with the school finance reform is because we have winners and losers anytime we change those slices of pie. And if we can't put more money into the system so that everybody at least wins something, you're not going to get all the votes you need to affect that change. So I don't know what the answer is, but certainly we've got to somehow as Texans decide what we want government to provide, how much it should cost, and how we want to pay for it. And we just have to have that conversation.
The question is about teacher retirement. Could you catch us up on the promises we've made as a state? Are we actually meeting those promises now? Are we pushing the costs more and more onto the retired teachers? And what do you see for the future for them?
Yeah, we are pushing more of the costs on to the retired teachers, that's for sure. We did have a kind of a joint buy-in this time to having something that shared the pain, if you will. The biggest issue this session was the TRS Care, the health program, which was absolutely going to be insolvent. And we had to address that was the immediate concern. The retirement part had been taken care of to some extent last session, so there wasn't as much fiddling around with that this time. But certainly what we have seen is the state in good times has not put in the amount of money that it should have into our pension programs. And so then when times are lean, we call on the retirees more and more to bear parts of the cost of that. With the teacher retirement system as opposed to the state employee retirement system, we're also asking more of our local school districts at the same time that we're giving them less money. So it's a challenge, and there are changes being made, continually being made to address when you can retire and how that impacts your pensions. And certainly we've done the same now with the TRS Care in terms of a phase-in several years from now that's going to not kick in the health benefits until age 65. I think that's 4 years from now that that's supposed to kick in. So indeed, yes, the state has not been putting in the amount it needs to when it has been flush, and so now we find ourselves having to push more off onto the retirees. I have to say, on behalf of Texas, that we are not as bad as a lot of other states that have worse problems. That doesn't make me feel particularly good, but at the same time, when you look at the bond rating for our state, one of the things that's looked at is our pensions, and we typically do fairly well in that category because we are better than many others, but we could do better.
Representative Howard, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you all.